have the meeting recording going. Great, thank you. Hello, my name is Sarah Grant, Transportation Manager with the City and County of Broomfield. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the Midway Multimodal Plan. Next slide, please. We've got a few instructions for you before we get going. And for interpretation,
Tenemos aquí
please connect using a
instrucciones.
tablet
Para
or
escuchar
computer.
interpretación, por favor, utilice una tableta o computadora.
Go to the globe icon in the bottom right of your screen.
Puse el icono del globo en la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla.
And select the language of your preference, English or Spanish.
Seleccione el lenguaje de su preferencia, ya sea inglés o español.
Thank you, Sarah. And we're going to wait
Gracias,
a second
Sara. Y vamos a esperar un segundo,
so that channel can get started.
dado que podamos empezar.
And I'm not sure if everyone's seeing the globe in the bottom part of their screen. Is everyone able to see that? Nate, I'm not sure if we have the option available here.
It took a minute, but it didn't show up.
I think it just popped up.
Great. Okay, so Luz Maria, if you can say something and we'll see if we can just see you or hear you as well. Looks like we're good. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Sarah. My name is Alicia Zimmerman and I'm with Fox Tuttle. I am a consultant for the Broomfield project team. So I'm leading the project team here through this Midway multimodal action plan. It does look like we have lower attendance today, which will mean that we can have a little bit more discussion, which will be great. This is the first time we've done a midday public meeting, and we didn't know if it meant a different group of people could participate, so we thought we'd give it a try. So thank you to those of you who are participating, and we may actually try unmuting further into the meeting to kind of make it a little more open dialogue. But before we get there, before we get started, I'm going to go through a few kind of orientation pieces here. First being rules of engagement. We're going to be using the Q&A box or you can raise your hand during the Q&A session at the end of each topic for questions. You are welcome to put questions in the Q&A box at any point during the presentation. The main rules of engagement here really are just to be friendly, be respectful of the project team and your neighbors. Obviously don't use profanities or inappropriate language. So that's where we're starting from here. And also to let you know, this is a real goal of ours to speak slowly and deliberately so everybody can understand. And so we have time for interpretation. We're going to pause at the end of each slide as well for a second to allow Luz Maria to catch up to our quick pace. So for Zoom orientation, you've probably been on Zoom meetings recently. This one may be set up a little different. So I'm going to go ahead and go through it. As Sarah mentioned, the meeting is being recorded. The default on this type of Zoom meeting is that participants are muted. The Q&A, any questions you have will be submitted through the Q&A button on the screen. And you can see this little icon here noted on our image. And then we're going to use that for questions throughout the presentation. And then the chat box, we're reserving for answers to poll questions, which is a little bit different. We'll get practice here in just a second. So this chat button, well, we'll see it regardless. We're going to separate out for polling questions. Again, please be respectful, even in anything that we type in here. And then after the meeting, broomfieldvoice.com/midway plan is the way to see, go back and watch the meeting again. It's also the way to see any additional information if we didn't get to all the questions this meeting, that type of thing. So keep an eye on that after the meeting, starting on Friday or next Monday, depending on how quickly we can get it up. And the phone number, the hotline for this project is 303-464-5827. So since we have our kind of ground rules under us here, we're going to try our first polling session. And this one is just kind of a getting to know you type question. Pull up my poll window here. We're going to ask you this, and I see, you know, Bill and Ed are the two current attendees. So I'm still going to ask you to fill out the poll so that we have it on record. But we know that it could be a direct answer as well. So the first poll question, I'm going to pop it up on your screen here in just a second, and there will be instructions on there, but basically you just click on your answer. This is a multiple answer if you'd like. And then we'll close the poll in just a second and I'll show you the results. So we can check to see if the polling is working. So, okay, it is launched. And this question is about what best describes your interest in this corridor and this plan. So take a look and answer what's appropriate. And Ed and Bill, are you able to answer? Okay, and we have somebody else who hopped on as well. We have a poll question up right now just to kick the meeting off. If my team is not seeing the poll, let me know. It shows to me, oh, no, people are answering now. So the question that we're asking just right off the bat is, what best describes your interest in this project and this corridor? So if you have a second to answer here, we've got 2 none of the aboves. And we're missing 1, but okay, I'm going to go ahead and end this poll in 10 seconds. Feel free to ask in the chat if you're not able to participate in that and you're interested in participating. Okay. All right. I'm going to end the poll. And I'm going to share the results here. And what you should see basically is, like I mentioned, we have a smaller group today, and we also have a different representation that we have had for the other meeting, which just means that you all are here for a reason other than, you know, living on the corridor or being near. So because we're trying to always figure out who we're chatting with and make sure we have the right presentation for you, maybe you can, I know at least one person is representing part of the project team. So maybe the other folks can answer what your interest is in the chat. All right, we're going to stop sharing that and feel free to enter that whenever. We'll keep an eye on it. So, oh, and I just see 2 instances. I'm keeping an eye on this participant. So it might be that one of you is working on being able to access that. Let us know if you have technical difficulties. We have this first Q&A session in here just to show you how these go. If anybody does have a question already on procedure, feel free to enter it in the Q&A function here. Click on the Q&A button and it'll pop up a window. And if anybody's on the phone, it doesn't appear anybody is, feel free to type *9 and it'll show us that you raised your hand. So we're going to keep moving unless we have any questions. I don't see any. Okay. Okay, so a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. We have until 1:30, but I'm hoping to get you out a little bit early And it might be quicker too, because we can kind of have more dialogue in a more effective or efficient, I should say, setting with fewer people. So we'll see how that goes. We're going to talk about project background of this Midway multimodal action plan, and just kind of what it is and why we're doing this project. Mark's going to talk through that. And then he's going to get into existing conditions, which is kind of the data we've gathered so far. And we're going to do a poll and Q&A. And last, we're going to talk about a toolbox and ideas for the corridor. Now, these aren't specific ideas. It's just kind of general ideas that we've been, going through with the project team as, hey, we should consider this. And before we move into kind of assigning those ideas and talking specifics, we wanted to get public input, which is why we're doing this today. So that's our outline today. And quickly, before we get to that project background, I want to talk common terms so that everybody's on the same page here. The first term is multimodal, and most of you are probably familiar with this, but it is new to some people. Multimodal is simply multiple modes of transportation. It means that this plan, because this corridor is multimodal by nature, this plan is considering how to improve transportation for all modes. The transportation vision in Broomfield means that you're looking at moving people, not just cars. And so in this graphic we have here, you can see that cars are represented on the roadway. Also, right next to them is a type of bicycle, a bicycle mode of travel and a facility for them. There's parking as well. There's pedestrians along here. Also, we're considering transit, and also just making sure that we're considering the full range between pedestrians and bicycles, those in wheelchairs or on scooters, that type of thing as well. So multimodal is multiple modes of transportation, which is what we're focusing on. The second of three terminology slides here talks about the pedestrian realm. Sidewalk, most people are familiar with that one. In this case, it shows the yellow, which is actually what we call a detached sidewalk, just away from the back of the curb. And then attached sidewalk would be if this graphic showed a sidewalk in that orange area through here. It means it's attached to the curb, which is right at the edge of the roadway. And those two types of treatments feel very different. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Multi-use path is also usually behind the curb. And so we're talking about it here as something that can be right behind the curb or further detached, and is usually a little bit wider than a sidewalk. And the goal for a multi-use path is to accommodate those on bicycle as well, usually. Our last terminology slide here has quite a few on it. Pedestrian refuge is this first, you'll see them, you have them on Midway already. The spot where it provides a refuge in the middle of a crossing movement for, in this case, calling out as pedestrians. All that means is that it makes it a little more comfortable because you're crossing one direction of traffic and having a break before you cross the rest. Bump outs are our second one, and bump outs are this yellow area here. And you can see the curb and the sidewalk and the pedestrian space is bumped out, in this case, kind of shadowing where the parking had been. And so the bump out will go through the benefits and the reasons that you would consider them later. That's what that's called. And then we have this general term, bike facilities or bicycle facilities. And bike facilities are, the facilities part is what confuses people if you're not familiar with it. All a bike facility is a space or some accommodation for people riding a bike. Generally, a bike facility is something like a bike lane or some of these more specialized type of bike lanes through here. Sometimes a bike facility is even, shared lane markings in the middle of a roadway. So we'll talk more on that, but even these markings in the middle of the intersection would be considered part of a bike facility. Protected bike lanes in this image are, an example is through here where the bike lane is protected from the moving vehicle traffic by a vertical element. In this case, it looks like a curb and potentially even a bus island here, but protected bike lane has vertical, whereas a buffered bike lane has only horizontal. So you see there's a little bit of extra space, maybe a few feet between the moving vehicular traffic and somebody on a bicycle. All right, so having gotten through that terminology, we'll get a little bit more into the meat here, and I'll turn it over to Mark, who's going to talk about project background.
All right, thank you, Alicia, and good afternoon, folks. My name is Mark Ambrosi. I'm a senior transportation planner with the City and County of Broomfield, and I am managing this project from the staff side for Broomfield. We're going to jump in a little bit to the project background, and first I'm going to talk about some of the guiding principles that drive transportation planning in Broomfield. And starting out, we'll talk about the transportation plan that was developed in 2016. This plan includes the guiding policies and strategies for transportation planning in the community. This plan was developed with feedback from residents in Broomfield. So many of these priorities and policies listed in this plan were developed with that input from the public. First thing I want to talk about with this plan is multimodal transportation. This plan highlighted the need to plan for all modes of transportation. Now, this includes, as Alicia said, pedestrians, bicycles, people driving, transit, and then various other forms of transportation that fall along that kind of spectrum. The second thing that jumps out at us from this plan is the focus on planning for people of all ages and abilities. So what this means is this plan establishes policies to ensure safe, functional, and efficient transportation system for all users. This could be children, older adults, people with mobility challenges, and then everybody else. The last thing I want to talk about from this plan is reducing the dependence on single occupancy vehicles. So this does not mean that Broomfield does not want people to drive. What it does mean is that we want to give people choices about how they get around the community. So making sure that there are options on the street network that go beyond just travel lanes and also include things like sidewalks and bike paths. All right, next slide, please. The second plan or document I want to talk about is the Broomfield Bicycle and Pedestrian Assessment. This was developed in 2019. And again, in large part, this was developed with input from people living in the community. The big themes of this project are safety and connectivity for bicyclists and pedestrians in the community. And Midway Boulevard really jumped to the top of the various corridors we investigated in Broomfield's transportation system. Just to give a few examples, it was the second highest priority for developing a low stress bicycle and pedestrian network. So right now, the results from this assessment indicated that there was a pretty high level of stress for pedestrians and bicyclists, and the community would like to see that addressed and improved. This corridor, Midway Boulevard, had the third most comments out of any area in the city. So the only two places with higher levels of comments were Sheps Crossing, which is the pedestrian bridge off of Midway, connecting to Industrial Lane and Industrial Lane. Generally, this plan talked about Midway Boulevard being a priority for bicyclists and making improvements for bicycles. And it also talked about the need for improved sidewalk facilities. All right, next slide, please. So what are we talking about when we're looking at this project? The project area extends the entire length of Midway Boulevard in Broomfield, and it actually extends a little into Westminster. So on the western side, there is a cul-de-sac where the Lake Link Trailhead is located, and it goes all the way east, basically to the Dry Creek Trail. So that's a little bit into Westminster, but we wanted to make sure that that connection was made and considered in this planning effort. I also want to just talk about these other dots on this graphic that you're seeing in front of you. Midway Boulevard connects many of the key community facilities in Broomfield. They're either on the corridor or close to the corridor. So that's why it's so important to really be focusing on pedestrian and bicyclists and just travel through the corridor and across the corridor. Now, these include places like schools, places of worship, municipal facilities like City Hall, the DMV, the library, parks, recreation centers, and then also community facilities like Fish and Health and Human Services. All right, next slide, please. So why are we meeting today? This meeting is part of our effort to reach out to the public and the people living in Broomfield. We need your help in identifying the solutions that are going to make Midway Boulevard safer and more equitable for everybody using it. Midway Boulevard is, we've seen it's a really important corridor to the community, and your voice is going to be essential in the development of this plan to ensure that this corridor meets the expectations of the community and works really well for the people who live near it and use it on a kind of daily basis. Next slide, please. So getting into the schedule, the first thing I want to point out in this graphic is the big teal oval, public engagement. Public engagement is a key component throughout the entire project and kind of extending beyond the project to project implementation. Running through the schedule for this project, it began in the spring of 2021, where we kind of came up with a strategy for how we wanted to implement the project. In the spring and kind of through this period right now, we've been focusing on data collection and analysis to understand what's happening out in the corridor. We also kicked off the public engagement. So the Broomfield voice page was created for this project. It has project information and opportunities for engagement. Moving past this meeting, kind of in the fall and into the winter, we're going to be taking the information that we collected in the summer and the feedback that we have from the public to start developing alternative designs for different areas of the corridor and basically come up with a few concepts. That is going to transition into a second round of public meetings where we're going to be reaching back out to you and getting input about which alternatives you like. And so we can put together kind of one complete package for the corridor. In the winter, we're going to be basically taking that one package that we come up with, creating a prioritized list of projects and coming up with some cost estimates for individual projects. So we have a basic understanding of, the order of magnitude of how much these various projects that this plan comes up with are going to cost. Now moving out into the spring, there will be a final plan and recommendations that come along with that plan. And that's going to allow us to begin implementation of the projects in this plan kind of in the summer, then moving out into the future. Now, I don't want to suggest that all of the projects are going to happen at one time. This is probably going to set us up and identify projects that we're going to be addressing over the next 10 to 15 years. In the short term, we'll be able to do kind of the low-hanging fruit projects like striping in bike lanes or maybe making some sidewalk improvements in targeted areas. As we move out into the future and identify funding, we will be taking on some of the bigger projects like intersection improvements or maybe more transitional changes to the corridor. Next slide, please. All right, now jumping into the existing conditions preview. This is kind of a summary of the information we have collected so far. Next slide. Starting out, this first graphic just kind of showcases what is out there today. So the arrows on here show basically the number of lanes in different sections of the corridor. So Obviously, in some areas, there are some turn lanes and maybe there are some short areas with 2 lanes, but generally on the western side of the corridor, it's 1 lane in each direction. And as you move east past Sheridan Boulevard, we get into a 4-lane section of the road. The stoplights are stoplights, so those would be signalized intersections. The dots and the kind of star looking things are crosswalks and enhanced crosswalks. So those stars would be crosswalks with a flashing beacon, or something that's a little more robust than just paint on the road. And finally, on the bottom, we're showing just the existing speed limits throughout the corridor. This isn't the speed cars are necessarily going, but this is what the speed limits are. Next slide, please. This slide is showing average daily vehicle traffic. So this is traffic averaged over a 24, 48 hour period that we're seeing on the roadway. It represents a daily traffic volume. So this is over a 24-hour period. And just a couple of things to point out here. On the eastern or western section of the corridor, kind of west of US 287, we have some lower traffic volumes relative to other areas of the corridor. In addition, around the field and the government buildings, the traffic volumes are a little more modest than you see kind of between US 287 and Main Street and kind of east of Sheridan Boulevard. So when we're talking about traffic, 1,700 or 17,000, those types of numbers, those are pretty high traffic volumes on this corridor. Now they're about a third of what you'd see on 120th, but nevertheless, they're still pretty high. Next slide, please. So this slide takes a little bit more analysis to understand what's going on. So I'm going to jump into the top half of this slide and kind of describe what you're seeing here. So what we're looking at in this slide is end-to-end trips from major intersections. So these would be cars going from, let's say, US 287 all the way through the corridor to Zuni. And then similarly from Main Street to Zuni as you kind of move further east on that top section. I really want to point out the numbers though. The vehicles starting at US 287, only 12% of them are going all the way through the corridor to Zuni Street. So that means that 90% of the vehicles are going somewhere on the corridor or near the corridor. We have a very similar distribution on the bottom half. So those westbound trips, the vehicles starting at Zuni going all the way to US 287 is only about 13% of all vehicles. So again, showing that these folks are going somewhere along the corridor or near the corridor, most likely. Next slide, please. So what this is telling us is that this is not cut through traffic or regional commuting traffic coming from Thornton or further abroad. What this indicates is that this is people who live on the corridor. So when we're thinking about things like people driving over the speed limit or the amount of traffic, that's really us. And I think that that's important for us to keep in mind when we're coming up with solutions to some of these issues that we see on the corridor. Next slide, please. This slide is showing us a little bit of the crash history. So for vehicles, this is a 5-year crash history. And for bicycles and pedestrians, this is a 7-year crash history. Now I want to kind of step back a little bit. And we spoke about the 2019 bicycle and pedestrian assessment. So that assessment told us that within Broomfield, 20% of the pedestrian and bicycle crashes in Broomfield are happening on Midway Boulevard. And so that's really significant. And I think that that really helps drive the point home of why we were really focusing on making improvements for bicyclists and pedestrians. This is a heavily used corridor by these members of our community, and we need to make sure it's safe out there for them to ride along it and to cross it. Now, I don't want to take anything away from the vehicular crashes. There are absolutely vehicular crashes along the corridor as well. And so we're going to be looking at ways to make safety improvements for all modes of transportation through this corridor. Next slide, please. Finally, we have some speed data here. And so at the top, we're again showing those existing speed limits. And at the bottom, below the corridor, we're showing the 85th percentile speed. And so I just want to mention a few things about this 85th percentile speed. There are 15% of people who are using this roadway going faster than that speed. That's what this is telling us. I also want to point out that we have some areas on this corridor where we see people going pretty quickly. Between Sheridan and Lowell Boulevard, the average speed is roughly 10 miles an hour over the speed limit. And in some of the other areas, we heard this in the first meeting, it looks a little bit lower. So between US 287 and Main Street, you're seeing, people going right around the speed limit. This is an average over a 24-hour period. So this includes congested periods like the morning and the afternoon when people are dropping off kids at school. And so those might bring down those averages, and we might have to look at this data a little more closely to really understand in those off-peak hours of the day, which is most of the day, are people going faster than that 85th percentile that we're showing here. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Alicia to bring us through the rest of the existing conditions information.
Thank you, Mark. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that data that we've gathered, which is really just empirical data, means for Midway and how we kind of start looking at it. Certainly not, this isn't the extent of it, but just an example here. Broomfield uses national and local guidelines and standards for developing their roadway and developing many things as well. But one of the standards that they're starting to use right now is a new standard from FHWA, Federal Highway Administration, FHWA, that shows a speed versus volume table effectively, or chart, that helps agencies determine what type of, in this case, bicycle facility is appropriate on a particular roadway. The reason I'm showing you the bicycle piece of how we might be using this data is because bicycle infrastructure is an area of transportation planning and design that is probably moving the fastest and has some new precedent throughout the United States, and as such is less familiar to folks. So this is something that is also new to Broomfield staff as they start using this type of tool in design. So what I want to point out here is that these orange dots are the plotted 85th percent, actually the plotted speed limit versus volume that we measured. You'll notice that the two locations to the west of 287 are on the chart in the close to the bike lane or buffered bike lane, and then maybe a little bit above the bike lane into the separated bike lane or shared use path, but everything else is up here off the charts, quote unquote, just meaning that it really is well into the separated bike lane or shared use path category. So that's one example of how we might use that. Excuse me. We might use that data moving forward and some of the things we're looking at. Just for reference, we'll talk through these specifically a little bit later in our kind of ideas section, but the white portion of this chart here represented shared lanes or bike boulevard. And that is, in fact, you have one on a section of Midway in the more commercial section just east of 287, where there's a shared lane marking on the roadway. And it means those people on bikes and those people in cars are sharing the same space. This light blue area includes a conventional bike lane, which you all have out there as well, and a buffered bike lane, which is that additional horizontal space I mentioned. The dark blue, separated bike lane, and some people call them protected bike lanes or shared use path. I showed two different separated bike lane examples here. I didn't put a shared use path on there because Broomfield folks are used to seeing what a shared use path is. So you're probably familiar with that. But this separated bike lane just means that there's a vertical component anywhere from being on the same road, but with a vertical component between you and the car, to being actually up at the sidewalk grade, but being separated from that sidewalk. So this is one of the ways that we're going to use that existing conditions data in considering alternatives and ideas. I also want to talk again, because the kind of bicycle facility changes and the different approach to how we design for people on bicycles is relatively new. I want to talk a little bit about background on bicyclists. This is a study that was done a little while ago by a guy named Roger Geller, and it has been kind of taken hold and been repeated now by different agencies. And there was a study done recently by an organization in the Denver area that confirmed the percentages that Roger was finding in other parts of the country. And what they studied were what type of bicyclists people are across the spectrum of the community. And he found of all the people, well, in Denver found of all the people you asked in the general population, 4% are highly confident bicyclists, 12% are somewhat confident, 59, so almost 60% are interested but concerned, and then 25% are people who we say are no way, no how. They're just not interested in riding a bicycle, regardless of what facilities are out there. So the no way, no how people end up being pedestrians, in addition to the other groups, but that's kind of why we show them as that. And what this means to us and why we use this is knowing that only 16% of people regularly feel comfortable biking today. And that number may be probably even lower in the Midway corridor because of the bike facilities that are, or lack of continuity that are out there. And more importantly, there are 60% of people who would be interested in riding a bicycle if it were safer and more convenient. So this is a pretty big population that can help with providing that alternative mode choice. If people do want to use it to get their kid to school or even for recreation, there's a segment of the population that really we need to make sure that we're considering in selecting the alternatives as we move forward. We've also done a little bit of community involvement so far. This is our first round of public meetings. But for this project, we've really chosen to take a multi-pronged approach to outreach. And I think that's relatively new for Broomfield. While you all are really, get out there and talk to people group, it is something to have this like public meetings and meeting people in person and having, digital outreach and stuff, marrying that all together is maybe a little bit newer. And so just want to summarize quickly what we've looked at so far. Our initial outreach efforts to date include 2 pop-up meetings, one at National Night Out and one just last weekend at Broomfield Days. And it was really cool to see how many people stopped by the booths and whether they were passionate about it and looking to give input or just curious and providing their kind of passing input. Those are both equally valid and important to collect. We have 3 online workshops this week, and that is we're in the second of the 3. And one thing we're trying with this one is a midday meeting, which is less common. And so we're trying to see if we get a different group of people or different number of people. And up through the end of August, we had 177 online map-based comments. That's on that Broomfield Voice webpage. I'll show you in a second. So we're getting a lot of great great input online as well. There have been, in order to advertise all these, there have been direct mail postcards in English and Spanish, as well as social media comments and kind of contacts quite a bit. So the Broomfield comms team is doing a great job kind of getting the word out. This is just a screenshot quickly to show the comments on the corridor. This is the online engagement tool, the map part. And you just have to click on the map thing the map tool, and you can, when you zoom in, these comments kind of space out to show you exactly where they've been input. You can just click, tell what category it's in, and then type your input. So we're getting some really good input here. Please also submit there and pass the website on to your neighbors as well. A quick snapshot, and I want to make sure I'm clear that this is a snapshot. It's not, you know, the data we're going on from here on out. It's just to say we read all of these, we keep an eye on it to see what the general public consensus is, and we also input all data we get into this so that it's all kind of comparable across platforms. So currently the snapshot with 252 comments as of the end of August, 64% of them are what we would consider safety related. And then, as I mentioned, they're from those three sources: National Night Out, social media, Broomfield Voice Map. As of right now, the main kind of concerns or areas that folks are commenting on are crossing concerns, so how to get across the roadway, intersection concerns, and then bicycle facility concerns. And you can see, you know, down throughout the rest with parking and loading being at the bottom. That's not to say that they are not going to be considered. It's just that they have had fewer comments today. 70% of these comments are from the Broomfield Voice online map too. So it just gives you a feeling of what our split is here. So we're to our second polling question. We're going to ask 2 questions, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A as well. I see that we did get a question already, so we can try and give that an answer too. But before we do that, I want to bring up our second poll. And like I said, we've got a smaller group today, so I'm be ready, because I might ask you a question or ask you to answer some supplemental info in chat here. But our second, let me pull up here, our question 2 and 3 are about the existing conditions data. And I'm going to pull them up at the same time so you can answer both of them, because it's pretty nuanced, the difference. The first question is asking whether what we've presented so far matches your experience of the corridor. And the other question is about whether you, even if it doesn't match your experience, whether you say, yeah, I can believe that that's the accurate data given what they studied. So it's really like, do you accept the existing conditions as the second question, and does it match your experience as the first? Now, I do know that given our answers to our first poll question, that we may only have 1 or 2 people answering this as users of the corridor. But if you have connections to folks along the corridor or know much about the corridor, feel free to answer too, even though if you're not like a regular user. So I'm going to go ahead and launch. And hopefully you can see this poll, and we'll leave it open for just a minute here. I'll stop talking so you can read. Okay. Okay, I think we're just about at, yeah, looks like we're at about the number we're going to get. So I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So if you all can see the results, you see that as far as whether it reflects your experience, we've got a yes, we have maybe, and then not sure. So for the yes and maybe, I think that usually means that we're kind of representing it. The person, whoever, let's see, we had 1 saying maybe, feel free to add into the chat, and I see there's more in the chat here, about why you say maybe. If it's just general, still trying to process, that's fine. But if there's something specific that you're not sure about, definitely please add that in the chat now. And then similarly, for the second question, we say, yes, I agree with it. Cool, I'm on board with that data. And then there are a few not sures. The not sure folks, please do answer in the chat what makes you not sure about it. Is it just general, I'm not that familiar with the corridor, or is it something specific about the data? I'm going to leave that hanging out there for just a second and then. Okay. Got it. And it's, I see that I'm not sure because it's an individual who's less familiar with the a portion of the corridor rather than the whole corridor. So, okay. Well, cool. That's our job, is to make sure that we have that data accurate. And it's also to make sure that we get input from those throughout the corridor, which it looks like we are. So hopefully we can help you all are helping inform us and inform you. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing poll results and we're going to go to a Q&A for the existing conditions before we move on to the toolbox ideas. So we've got about 7 minutes for Q&A, and I see that there are a few questions and a few comments here. The first question from Ed is about, of the accidents, what's the ratio among car-to-car accident, a car-to-bike accident, and a car-to-pedestrian accident? I can tell you, I haven't done the math for the car. I'm going to go back to that slide here so we can talk about it. I haven't done the math of the ratio of maybe the car and pedestrian, sorry, the bicycle and pedestrian crashes versus the car crashes. But I can tell you that in general, I can't do two things at once here. You'll have to be patient with me. Here we go. In general, any of the pedestrian and bicycle accidents that are reported and are on this list, it usually is because they are a crash that occurs with a car. So a pedestrian versus a car, or a bike versus a car. And the reason for that is also the reason we always take bicycle and pedestrian crash rates with a grain of salt. And that is because the only reported crashes are usually ones that include a vehicle which, you know, get called into the police. So for every bicycle and pedestrian crash that is represented here, there are usually quite a few near miss locations where there was almost a crash, or sometimes a bicycle pedestrian crash. I can't say I've seen a lot of reported pedestrian crashes, but let's say a bicycle pedestrian crash that isn't reported because nobody calls it into the police and puts it in the system. So that is one of our opportunities here and online through the online mapping, is to report near misses so that we can make sure that this crash picture is well-rounded. Caleb, feel free to unmute and correct me if Caleb was the crash picture guy here. So correct me if I'm wrong there. Hearing nothing from Caleb, we'll go ahead. So the next question is, does the FHWA graph showing volume and speed take into account the current vehicles per day or the goal of the future reducing the amount of vehicles per day? Lisa, that's a really good question. So I'm going to go back to that. So this graph is used a number of different ways. And the way that most agencies use it, because it's the most defensible and straightforward, is saying the number of vehicles per day that we've measured. Some agencies are projecting future volumes and also using it here. Now, a lot of places you're looking at protected or separated bike lanes are also in areas that are more built out. And so the future volumes aren't as different. But I think your question actually refers to if the volumes are actually going down, or the goal is to get the volumes to go down. What if this dot goes back into a different type of bicycle facility? And that is honestly a condition that I've never seen fully happen, because usually the mode shift from, say, people in cars to people in transit, which might reduce the volume on a road just offsets future growth. There are a few locations where it has actually overall reduced traffic, but we haven't been at a condition where it actually changes the recommended facility type. So certainly something to consider at a threshold, when the dot is at a threshold though. So go ahead, Mark. Sorry.
I would also add that based on the population growth projections in the Front Range as a whole, on Midway, we are very likely going to see an increase in traffic and not a decrease. And that's even if we make changes to Midway, like traffic calming or other things of that nature that would, maybe push vehicles to 120th or 136th Avenue. So just based on the raw projections for population growth, it's likely that we will not see lower volumes in the future, at least on this corridor.
That's also just to add an interesting, transportation nerd approach to COVID adds to that as well. So we're certainly studying that, and agencies are studying that throughout the country. But very astute question. And I think right now what we're showing on this graph are the existing ADT. So, and then I see another question about impacts of a potential facility type. And Ed, we will get to that question in the, you're welcome, Lisa. Ed, we will get to that question after we talk about some ideas, and don't let me skip it. So holler if I have forgotten it, but we're going to talk next through some ideas and what they might look like, just in general, not specific to Midway, but kind of ideas for what we might consider in concepts. So let's see, do we have any more here? I think if we don't, we're going to move on to the next phase. One of my teammates holler if not, but I'm going to pull us back onto the next.
Yeah, Alicia, just wanted to point out we had a comment from Ed earlier about the bike lane discomfort is another 20%. So I think that's in reference to the overall comments that we were hearing from the community.
Got it. So I see what you're saying. Oh, yeah. Okay. So in reference to in reference to this slide, when you look at the percentage of bike facilities, bike lane, 20, yes, 20 out of 200. So in this case, it's 10%. And we're looking at these in detail too. For instance, what does bicycle facilities mean versus bike lane discomfort? And are those overlapping? Do we need to collapse those into the same data or not? We're looking through specific categories, but that's a good point. That's certainly something we've been hearing, as well as vehicle speed. Okay, with that, I think we're going to move on. I am going to, once I can get to the right slide here, I'm going to turn it over to Mark to start digging into our toolbox on ideas.
All right, thank you, Alicia. So yeah, we are going to jump into now talking about some toolbox and ideas. I am going to talk a little bit about how we're thinking about the corridor to begin. So next slide. So this graphic right here illustrates how we have kind of broken up between Broomfield staff and the consultant team, Midway Boulevard into different sections with potentially different characters. Just to give a brief example, if you look at the yellow bubble all the way on the west side of the corridor, that area, again, has lower traffic volumes and different land uses surrounding it. So that's an area that we're going to look at as kind of its own package. And as we're kind of moving through the corridor, potentially different solutions might be more appropriate for these various areas. With that said, we are trying to make sure that throughout the corridor, there are consistent facilities and that they are predictable. So we don't want them to be varying too widely, but this is gonna just helps us think about the different areas and maybe what the different needs might be in those areas. At the bottom, there's a few examples of some of these character areas, and you can see that they look pretty different. And so we'll get into that a little bit more in the upcoming slides. Next slide, please. So starting out again, with that very western section, this is the Lake Link Trail to US 287. So this section of the corridor, I'm just going to say is probably one of the least complex from a roadway standpoint. This is an image of this area. It's pretty wide asphalt between the curbs, narrow attached sidewalks, no bike lanes. In this area, we see pretty heavy truck traffic, or percentages of vehicles. A lot of those are going to be heavier trucks because the land use is more industrial. And so that's also why there is this center turn lane here. Trucks will park there, stage there. And so that remains pretty important out here. Now, with that said, we do have a lot of space. And so striping in bike lanes, that's a pretty easy solution out here, and maybe something that we're going to look at. Yeah, and just to finish this area today, while it provides a great connection to Sheps Crossing, and that's used pretty heavily by bike commuters and people walking, this is probably not the area that you're going to go on a walk after dinner, because it is that a little bit more industrial feel out there. And maybe that changes with some of these improvements that come out of this study. Next slide, please. The next bit I'm going to talk about is really kind of two sections. And this first one is looking at, so this is US 287 to Maine, but I'm going to talk about this as US 287 to Midway Park. That's kind of the images you're seeing here. So this is more commercial uses adjacent to the roadway. There are very high traffic volumes and higher levels of crashes through this area. There's a mix of travel lanes. I think it can be a little bit confusing for commuters who have not used this area too much, just because some of those lanes turn into turn lanes. Sometimes they're through lanes. And it also has pretty inconsistent bicycle facilities throughout this. In some areas, it's going to be striped bike lanes that are pretty narrow, and you're next to 2 lanes of traffic, and there's high traffic volumes. You can also see kind of in this image down in the bottom left, it's a shared bicycle facility in this area. And so that might be pretty uncomfortable for somebody who's not a very confident bicycle rider. Additionally, you have some attached sidewalks. They're about 5 to 6 feet wide, so they're not really wide, and they don't do a great job of accommodating maybe your less confident bicyclists. In addition, we have some limited space through this entire area between US 287 and Maine. It's one of the older areas of the community, and so the right-of-way, we have less right-of-way to play with when we're making solutions. So we're gonna have to get a little bit creative in this area. Next slide, please. So this next bit is kind of from the Midway Park area over to Main Street. And so this becomes more residential. You have the First Filing and other neighborhoods in this area. There's Nativity Church. There are some schools or some parks. But the roadway continues to be pretty narrow overall. Again, high vehicle volumes and quite a few crashes. This area gets pretty congested with some of the school traffic in the morning and afternoon. There are a lot of people and kids around this area because of the parks. And, here we have, again, kind of shared bike facilities with the travel lanes, and that can be uncomfortable, particularly for younger people. I don't know that I would want my kids riding their bike to school in this roadway during the peak traffic hour. And the sidewalks are pretty narrow. You can actually see in the bottom left here, somebody's riding their bicycle on the sidewalk because they're not comfortable riding on the road. And in the top right image, you can see some of that school traffic and some of the congestion out here. And so These are the times of day that are maybe bringing some of those average speeds down that we saw in the earlier graphic, because people are just sitting and waiting to make their turn. And so these are the times of day that people are generally going a little bit more slowly. All right, well, next slide. The next section is Main Street to Sheridan, and this is the newest section of roadway. I'm told it did not exist. It probably was built sometime in the late 80s or early 90s. So before that, we were speaking to some people at Broomfield days that remember when it was not there. This section of the roadway is defined by a single lane in each direction, separated by a wide vegetated median strip with mature vegetation, so pretty big trees. I think you can feel pretty comfortable out here as a motorist sometimes and maybe forget that there might be people around because it's really kind of isolating. You have your own space. There is a little bit more roadway in this area to play with. As you can see, there's a striped in bike lane being shown on the right-hand side over here. Some areas do have on-street parking. There are some kind of varying widths of sidewalks through this area. Some of them are attached, some of them are detached, set a little further away from the road. One of the things that we've heard in this section is it can be difficult to notice pedestrians because of that mature vegetation in the median areas. And so there are a few challenges out here, but we also have some really nice opportunities for people or to make changes through this area. Even things like adding a buffer to the bike lane might make people more comfortable in this area. All right, next slide, please. The rest of the roadway, we're kind of going to talk about it in one section. This is the 4-lane section. It's Sheridan and everything east out to Zuni. This is 4 lanes, higher travel speeds. I think the speed limit is 40 out in this area. There is still that median with mature vegetation in it. As you can see, there is some limited space in this area for actually making bicycle facilities on street. And so this might be an area that we'll have to think about or explore different ideas for how do we pull those bicycle facilities off the street. The other thing to note is it's pretty high speeds and there's a lot of traffic volume out here. And so it might not be comfortable for everybody on this section of roadway on a bike. In the image over on the right-hand side, you can see, I think this is the westbound. There is no sidewalk facility directly adjacent to the roadway. So that's an area that we have a gap. I also want to point out that the land uses adjacent to this area are primarily residential, and then there's quite a bit of open space as well. So there are a lot of people around here. There's a lot of places people want to go, and we really want to make this a little bit more comfortable and accessible for people that don't want to drive and maybe want to use other modes of transportation. All right, next slide. And I think I'm turning it back over now to Alicia. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Mark. So similar to last time, I'm going to say, okay, Mark's presented kind of what's out there. So what does that mean for our plan? And what that means for our plan is our next steps after we get kind of finish this data collection from the public are to start thinking about what alternatives we can look at and what type of treatments might change in particular areas of the corridor. And so our first step in doing that is to kind of develop a toolbox and think about broad level ideas. What might we want to see in on Midway? And I want to remind everybody that in general, the things that I'm going to go through here, the kind of example pictures, have all been, for sure, they've all been proposed in the Front Range, and most of them have been implemented in the Front Range and across the US. But many of them have already been proposed and discussed in Broomfield as well. This bicycle and pedestrian assessment that Mark went over before has a toolbox of sorts in it. And so we're starting from that as a base and making sure that we're coordinating with Broomfield's Public Works Department and basically the people who will have to maintain this and who will have to build this too. And so we are, while we're keeping the universe of options, we're also trying to focus on what makes sense in Broomfield. And some of these example pictures stretch that and, look at the world of opportunity. Lastly, these 3 design guides on the upper right just show that while kind of the traditional highway engineering transportation approach, like, some of the older roadway design guides apply in some areas, maybe not as urban, maybe, kind of out in the quote unquote countryside. There have been new guidelines that have been developed to address urban, constrained, higher number of different multimodal users. And those guides have been developed in the past, say, 5 to 10 years. And so we will be looking at those as well as Broomfield, moving through developing their own new guidelines. So NACTO is one organization that's looking at those more urban guides. And then also the DRCOG, the Regional Council of Governments, is looking at a guideline as well. So getting into our ideas here, starting on intersections. You all are familiar with this graphic already. Starting first on this bump out idea, my dog has come to join us, so I hope you don't hear her, but starting into the bump out idea, what bump outs are good for, we already talked about what they mean. They're pulling the curb out. Without a bump out here, the curb may have come right along about here. And so pulling the curb out at an intersection or even in a mid-block location, what that means is it reduces the crossing distance for this guy here walking across the roadway. That means it's easier, more comfortable for him to cross, and he's exposed for a shorter period of time. It also means he can see an oncoming bicycle or traveling vehicle better, and the traveling vehicle can see him better than, say, if there was a parked car here and he had to walk between them. So that is one of the benefits of a bump out. The other benefit of a bump out is that it can help with speed mitigation in 2 ways. It often increases what we call side friction. If you think about driving and you're driving, like, say, really close to a parked car, you're much more likely to pull back on your speed a little just to make sure you're doing it exactly right. Adding a bump out can do that a little bit too, because you're closer to that curb, even in a through, if you're in a car and you're driving straight through. It can also tighten the radius or just move the radius of a car that's turning here at an intersection, which slows down the turn and as such reduces potential conflict or potential severity if a crash were to occur for a pedestrian who's walking across the side street. So those are 2 potentials for a bump out that certainly we'll be looking at throughout. This picture is a little bit of a different one, but it's just to remind us, including the design team, that we don't have to look at these, in-depth permanent materials in every instance. There may be some quicker win projects that are in a slightly different material type that could either become permanent later or could give us a good test of what might work in an area. And so keeping an eye on that kind of temporary type installation as well. Here's a more permanent bump out, one you could very well see along Midway. You have your truncated domes, your redesigned curb ramps to help those in wheelchairs and with visual disabilities. And also basically, oh, my mouse froze here. Also basically, you can see that curb, the radius here would probably slow me down coming through here. So this is a little bit different one. It does show a type of a bump out. This is actually an example in Fort Collins, from a 2-lane to a 2 lanes each to a 4-lane to a 6-lane. So certainly a higher volume road that very well could apply at different points on Midway. That what this does here, this is actually a new multi-use path coming along. It sets, we call it a setback crossing. It sets that multi-use path crossing back from the traveled way of the roadway. So if you're coming along here in the foreground and you're about to turn right to go down this road, you are able to turn almost all the way so that when you encounter a pedestrian crossing this direction, you're able to see them straight on instead of seeing them kind of on the side right as you're turning into them. So a setback crossing is another, local example here. This one we call a raised crossing. And just to get our terms straight, this triangle here is a pork chop island. It's for whatever reason, the industry calls it a pork chop island. So that's what I'm going to call it, especially because people think that's funny and like to start calling them that themselves. So the raised crossing is the bit between the sidewalk on the side of the road and the sidewalk on the pork chop island. And you can see here the roadway ramps up to the crossing rather than the crossing ramping down to the roadway. And we also have a yield sign with a two-way crossing, which is a little bit different sign than is usually in this instance. What this raised crossing can do here is it slows people down in this yield condition. You have a few of these on the corridor. It slows people down because it is a little bit of a raise, increase in elevation. And it also increases the compliance. This crossing versus one that is not raised, more people driving cars will stop for pedestrians when it's raised than if it weren't raised. This picture is just to show you that basically we're not going to ignore the in-between intersections as well. This is a driveway and shows, doing some enhanced signing or striping at the driveway, as well as considering, additional configuration and signage changes. I also want to point out that we have some what we call ground plane markings or striping in the intersection that we can do. This example here is not the only thing, but one example of additional striping we can do for people riding bikes. This one is called a two-stage turn cue box. And all it does is it allows somebody on a bicycle coming in this direction to pull over to the right instead of having to cross traffic here to get in the left turn lane to make this turn. They're coming at us, they pull over to the right when they have a green light, and then they wait for this light to turn green and then proceed through. So there's certainly, this is the type of thing that are a little bit newer treatments that are, recently developed in, I'd say, the last 10 years that we'll be considering along Midway as well. As far as pedestrian facilities, you'll be a little bit more familiar with most of these, most likely. Multi-use paths, you have some, certainly considering widening the sidewalks if possible. We know most areas are really constrained by existing right-of-way or mature vegetation. We certainly don't want to take away that because this is an amazing area for that type of thing. So one of the things we thought about is, well, in areas we can't widen the sidewalk or increase and make a multi-use path, if that's what makes sense, what else can we do? And one of the things we looked at was, a soft surface trail or soft surface widening. There are maintenance challenges and things like that that we're talking through, with public works and maintenance, but just another idea that we may be considering. Also, ways to enhance a multi-use path. This one we were debating between the transportation nerds if this is actually a multi-use path, as in this case it's in Boulder, a multi-use path as they consider it there, or if it really is a sidewalk with a separate cycle track or two-way protected bike lane. And it doesn't really matter what we're calling it or what it actually is. What matters is how people are using it. In this case, it is a widened area. This specifically has separated modes, but it's a widened area that allows bicycles in both directions and pedestrians in both directions to use this facility and roadway more comfortably. Okay, so some crossing pedestrian treatments. This one is showing a raised mid-block pedestrian refuge island. We talked about the Ped Refuge Island. And it's showing even in a 2-lane roadway, having that refuge island for this pedestrian going across, as well as some enhanced signage. This one has these RRFBs, rectangular rapid flashing beacons, that you all are familiar with. You have some out on Midway already. So considering, you know, where those are the most appropriate, where other types of treatments may be more appropriate, but also just keeping in mind that RRFBs are the highest, maybe highest type of crossing that is still unprotected. And the reason I say it's unprotected is because it requires voluntary yielding. You know, you could come up to an RRFB and move through it, whereas, you know, an official signal with a red ball up there, you have to stop no matter what. So figuring out which crossings need what type of treatment, especially depending on the roadway configuration with, you know, for this one or another 4-lane section of the roadway, is really critical. So we're going to go through all of the existing crossings and any of the, you know, other ones we see identified as having challenge to make sure that the right treatment is applied. I've shown one more pedestrian refuge island here, just as an example. This is at an existing intersection. And this example shows one way to actually reduce the conflict points at an intersection. The way they've done this is they've actually eliminated some of the turns that were previously allowed at the intersection. Eliminating some of the turns reduces the potential crashes. Usually you see a crash reduction in the crash rate, but it also does make a, you know, changes to the turning boom that's allowed at an intersection. And the last thing this one could do is, for instance, if there was a turn lane coming up here and it was replaced by this median through the intersection, it provides a space for refuge, in this case, a bicyclist, but pedestrians and people on bikes that may not have been there before with all of the movements going on. And we can also have pedestrian refuge islands at intersections, as I was mentioning. And the other thing I wanted to point out here is just that they don't just help pedestrians. We call them pedestrian refuge islands, but bicyclists, especially those interested but concerned bicyclists, also use them. Another reminder that we can look at some of these with temporary or short-term or quick action type materials as well. And then this slide just shows that when we think of improvements, especially to transportation system, we think of changes on the ground or changes to the curb or the sidewalks, physical changes out there. There are operational, we call them operational improvements that we can do as well that don't necessarily require going out there and installing something. One example is a change to signal operations. And by signal, I mean the traffic light, traffic signal. This one is called a leading pedestrian interval, an LPI. And all it means is this is the first phase. You let pedestrians start going across the roadway before you let the people in vehicles go. And it means that, say, these pedestrians here can get a little ways into the roadway and get established in that roadway before you may have somebody turning across the path. Another way to reduce that, I think I called it a cartoon start, where the bike, or sorry, well, bike as well, but pedestrian and car go at the same time and the car is not recognizing that a pedestrian is crossing. So that's called an LPI. All right, a few bicycle facility ideas before we wrap up here. Looking at our toolbox, this has a few different things. It shows some green markings on the ground. It also shows a buffered bike lane, and it also shows what you might do with a enhanced bicycle lane at a transit stop. And so, like I said, green markings help people on bicycles know when they might intercept a car or expect to anticipate a car. And it helps people driving a car know when they might see a bicycle in their way, in their space. So these are just conflict markings and then some additional horizontal space for those on bicycle. One thing I want to point out too here is enhancing or installing bicycle facilities can also help pedestrians, and it can also help those in a car. It can help those in a car because, excuse me, it can also help those in a car because it delegates a space for people on bikes. And so you should have separation the majority of your traveled path. It helps those as on foot or pedestrians because it gives additional separation. If you're over here and there used to be cars traveling right here, and now they're all the way over here, you have a little bit more comfort in your travel path. A protected or separated bike lane is one, it looks like a buffered bike lane in this case, except with vertical protection. You can see those posts on the other side as well. And this is just a different kind of a protected or separated bike lane. It is actually a raised one. This one has different installation and maintenance considerations. And it also has different comfort considerations depending on what type of bicyclist you are. And I have this slide in here, not because it's the only thing we're considering. I don't want anybody to think that we're basing this entirely off of how expensive something might be to build or to maintain, but this is real money. It's your tax money. And that's why we're flagging it, just to say that you can have an increase of installation costs or an increase of maintenance costs based on, kind of how much more comfort or safety and what type of facility you're going in. So we're not designing this in a vacuum. All right, with that, and hopefully you could hear me through my dog's ruckus here. We're going to start with our last, well, second to last actually, polling session. And then we're going to get to any remaining questions. I saw Ed, you had a comment here as well. So let me pull up the polling here. Okay, so these next 3 questions, it's going to be 3 at once, are about whether we're looking at the right types of things. I'm sure we missed something. Please tell us what we missed. But the questions basically are, do you think any of these might apply to Midway? And absolutely say in the chat, if you say yes or maybe, share which ones you think would apply and where. If you say no, tell us which ones you think are a bad idea for Midway. Same question for number 2, except do you think any of them would actually make things safer and more equitable? And I will launch the poll in a second, so you're not needing to see it yet. The last question is whether there are other options the team should consider for Midway. And this is kind of a short answer. Absolutely feel free to answer additionally in the chat there. So I'm going to launch this and let you read through them and answer them. So we're getting some answers. I'm going to leave it open for about another minute. Okay, I think we've got most answers in here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results. So hopefully you can see the results. Answers to the first question about if they're applicable to Midway are yes and not sure. And I'm going to go to the short answer in a second because a number of them apply. All right, I noticed some that apply. Second question is, are they safer and would they make Midway safer and more equitable? And the answers are the same. In general, yes, but maybe some not sure. And then are there other options the team should consider? And I think that's really where a lot of these comments in the chat come from. The answers are generally yes and not sure. So I'm gonna stop sharing the poll results, but I'm gonna go now to both discussion about the answers and the Q&A. So I noticed, let's see, going back to, as mentioned in the Q&A, Greg notices or notes that we didn't talk about hybrid beacons or hawks, which are one step more than the rectangular rapid flashing beacon crossing treatment. And that's something that actually requires you to stop because it has a red, we call it a red ball or a red signal indication. And he notes that maybe some of the existing crossings could be considered to, kind of upgrade to a hawk. Greg, short answer is absolutely. We're keeping an eye on those. We're looking at volumes, we're looking at criteria, and also looking at precedent. So while I didn't specifically talk about them, that's not because they're not on the table. So we'll keep an eye. And the second part of what you have on there was about, or maybe it was somebody else. Now let's see, here we go. Here we go. Yes, road diet. Reallocation of use. Yeah, kind of reassigning a lane to a different mode, right? And that's something that is the short answer is it's being discussed. And Mark, correct me if you don't agree with how I answer this, but it's being discussed. It's a challenge because we're right on the boundary. Go ahead.
Yeah, we have some areas that we can use potentially some elements of a road diet, but we wouldn't necessarily be able to reduce lanes. Now, the section I'm thinking of is between 287 and Main Street. We could reconfigure some lanes potentially. We could maybe use some more of the right of way for those pedestrian and bicycle facilities. So maybe that looks like pulling the curbs in some areas. But there are also some tough discussions with parking. And we want to make sure we're sensitive to, the variety. I think there are opportunities in other areas, but that's something we'll explore. And we really need feedback from the public in that, getting into that concept. But it's certainly not off the table. We will be exploring it.
Maybe a good summary is that considering all of or reconsidering the existing curb to curb allocation is absolutely on the table. And it's just which component are we looking at, updating or modifying changes based on public input, political will, and transportation needs. Okay, so hopefully, Greg, I think those were both Greg. I'm going back up here trying to find it. Hopefully that answered your question on those. Please keep chatting in here if it didn't. And I know we're coming up right to the end here, so I want to get to everybody's. Ed notices that, from before in the presentation, he mentions the wide landscaped areas on the corridor and that he really likes them. Will barrier separated bike lanes reduce landscape areas? Short answer is we don't know yet. We're still looking at collecting data and seeing what, we're not assuming barrier separated bike lanes, the whole corridor. It just depends on the demands and the potential reallocation within the right of way. So answer is I don't know. I do know, I guess I will say that the landscaping and the existing corridor character is great through here. And we know that's really important to the residents along here and those traveling through here. So we want to make sure to maintain that character. It's not something that we're aiming to change at all. Okay. And then Ed also mentions, potentially considering some options to widen the sidewalks and stripe for bicycles and pedestrians. Absolutely, something we're looking at as we can. As Mark mentioned, it's some of the sections that's most critical are some of our tighter sections. So it's going to be a dance. And then also widening for cars may reduce car lanes when volume is increasing. And I think we kind of already talked about that, Ed. If you agree, we already had talked through that. And it is going to be, again, like I said, a dance when it comes to figuring out future volumes, what the roadway vehicular demands are, and how we can fit all of the modes, make all the modes comfortable through here. So Ed, if that wasn't what you were intending, certainly, chat again here so we can understand this well. So Lisa has one comment, and I'm just reading it now. So I think if the population you're trying to incorporate are users who are interested but concerned, solution for bikers should be off the street in a widened multi-use path or vertically protected lane. Painting green squares on the street can be confusing to cyclists and don't accommodate a lot of those groups, families. So that's a good point. It is providing facilities for a particular type of roadway user as well. So we'll keep that in mind. And I will say that I am a family, somebody who does family biking myself too. So I know where you're coming from there. Thank you for the comment. Greg has one more here, and then team, tell me if I'm caught up. Main area for road diet would be for him would be from Sheridan to Zuni, where there's 4 lanes for traffic. So we'll keep an eye on that. Thank you for giving us the specifics, Greg. Ed mentions if bikes are routed to a widened sidewalk, how do drivers entering Midway from the side streets be alerted to possible bicycles approaching? There are definitely treatments for that, and that is one of the challenges of a multi-use path. We have many examples from other projects and other communities at enhanced crossings, enhanced signage and markings, as well as being very deliberate about how far back from the road or right up against the road that path crosses. So we'll keep in mind your concern there as well, but it's definitely a challenge. So, okay, so I see we are just after 1:30. I want to make sure Mark gets time to do the wrap up here. Team, did I miss any major questions before we move on?
I think you got to them. Yeah, that last one was the kind of the driveway. How do you know when people are coming from those off streets? So okay, I think we've covered it.
Great. Then go ahead, Mark. We'll move on to next steps.
All right, so I'm just going to put up one more quick poll, and I can kind of talk it through while folks are responding to it. So this poll question is up here because Broomfield as a city government is really trying to make sure we're engaging a diverse cross-section of the community. That's part of the reason we're doing these public meetings, going to events, potentially doing some stakeholder, targeted stakeholder meetings. But if you wouldn't mind sharing your background and ethnicity, that would help us understand if we're reaching kind of a wider cross section of the community. And I'll leave this open for just another 20 seconds here. If you're uncomfortable answering this, do not feel obligated to, but this will help us understand if we need more targeted outreach. And you know what, I'll just leave this open while I'm talking about next steps. So next steps for this project, we are going to be using the information we have collected from the public and from our existing conditions to start the development of alternatives, as I mentioned before. We will be updating the project website with the latest information. We will have these meetings recorded. We have public engagement opportunities on the website. So tell your neighbors, tell your friends to go check it out. We will be following that up with a second round of public meetings and sharing some of the ideas we come up with you to get your feedback. So the project website, I think it's been mentioned, but I'll just say it again, www.broomfieldvoice.com/Midway plan. It's where you can find out the latest information and where we're going to be next. Or you can contact us by email at transportation@broomfield.org. Please just include Midway plan in the subject line so that we know it's about this project. You can call the transportation hotline to leave your comments about the project. And if you have questions, we'll do our best to get back to you within 48 hours. That's 303-464-5827. And so thank you so much for joining us today. I think we had some nice conversation. Hopefully you enjoyed the presentation and learned a little bit more about what we're trying to do out here. So thank you, Alicia, for the presentation. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you soon. Let us know if you have any more comments from the website.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon.